The Ukraine-Russia War, one of the most significant military conflicts in the 21st century, began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This invasion marked a culmination of years of geopolitical tension, regional conflicts, and a complex web of nationalistic and political ambitions. Over 2 years into the war, the world has witnessed widespread destruction, a humanitarian crisis, economic upheavals, and a massive realignment of global political alliances. As of September 2024, the war shows no signs of nearing a peaceful resolution. Russia has escalated its military campaign with renewed drone and missile strikes, while Ukraine, emboldened by significant Western military and financial support, continues its counter-offensive in the east and south. This video provides a comprehensive overview of the conflict's history, its causes, military strategies on both sides, the humanitarian catastrophe, and the broader geopolitical implications of the war. To fully understand the complexities of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, it is essential to examine the historical relationship between the two nations. Ukraine and Russia share a deep-rooted history that dates back to the medieval Kievan Rus, the political and cultural predecessor of both modern Ukraine and Russia. Throughout the centuries, Ukraine has been a battleground for various empires, from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the Russian Empire, which annexed much of Ukraine in the 18th century. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine declared its independence, marking the beginning of a new era. However, tensions persisted between Kyiv and Moscow, with disputes arising over Crimea, the Donbas region, and Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO and the European Union. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, followed by the war in eastern Ukraine between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists, set the stage for the 2022 invasion. The invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces in 2022 did not happen in isolation. Several underlying factors contributed to the escalation of hostilities, including: one of the main grievances expressed by Russian President Vladimir Putin was NATO's eastward expansion since the 1990s. As former Soviet states like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia joined the alliance, Russia viewed this as a direct threat to its sphere of influence and national security. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a watershed moment in post-Cold War Europe. This move was condemned internationally but received broad support within Russia. The annexation stoked tensions between Moscow and Kyiv, particularly regarding control over the Black Sea and energy resources. In the years leading up to the full-scale invasion, the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine became a focal point of conflict. Russian-backed separatists established self-proclaimed republics in Donetsk and Luhansk, leading to years of intermittent fighting and a fragile ceasefire under the Minsk agreements, which ultimately failed to bring peace. Ukraine's aspirations to integrate with Western institutions, including NATO and the European Union, were seen as unacceptable by Moscow. The potential alignment of Ukraine with Western powers, especially NATO, posed a significant challenge to Russia's desire to maintain a buffer zone of influence between itself and Europe. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which began on February 24, 2022, was a dramatic escalation in a conflict that had been simmering since the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing war in the Donbas region. Russian President Vladimir Putin declared the operation as a special military action, aimed at demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine, justifying it as a defensive response to NATO expansion and alleged threats posed by the Ukrainian government. The invasion was launched on multiple fronts, with Russian forces advancing from the north, toward Kyiv, east, and south, leading to widespread destruction in major Ukrainian cities. Within the first few weeks, it became apparent that Russia's initial objectives, which likely included the swift capture of Kyiv and the installation of a pro-Russian government, would not be easily achieved. The Ukrainian military, under the leadership of President Volodymyr Zelensky, mounted a robust defense, bolstered by civilian militias, territorial defense units, and volunteers. The Russian attempt to capture Ukraine's capital met with fierce resistance. Despite initial advances and the surrounding of Kyiv on multiple sides, Ukrainian forces repelled Russian attacks. By late March, Russian troops were forced to retreat from Kyiv and northern Ukraine, marking a significant early victory for Ukraine. In the south, Mariupol became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance as Russian forces surrounded the city, leading to one of the war's most devastating humanitarian crises. The port city was reduced to rubble after months of intense fighting. The eventual fall of Mariupol in May 2022 was a major blow to Ukraine but demonstrated the ferocity of the conflict. Sanctions and diplomatic isolation of Russia. Almost immediately after the invasion, the international community reacted with unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia. The United States, European Union, and their allies imposed sweeping sanctions targeting Russia's financial institutions, oligarchs, and industries. These sanctions, along with the freezing of Russian central bank assets, aimed to cripple Russia's ability to finance the war. Additionally, Russia faced growing diplomatic isolation, being excluded from international forums such as the G7 and G20. The first 6 months of the conflict set the tone for a war of attrition, with neither side able to secure a decisive victory. Russia's initial military objectives, which appeared to include the capture of Kyiv and other major cities, were thwarted. Ukrainian forces, supported by growing supplies of Western weaponry, mounted an effective defense, and by the end of the summer of 2022, had launched limited counteroffensives. The early months of the war exposed significant shortcomings in the Russian military's logistics and strategic planning. Supply lines were stretched too thin, resulting in stalled advances and vulnerable positions. Ukrainian forces exploited these weaknesses with guerrilla tactics and precision strikes. Reports of low morale, poor coordination, and heavy losses further compounded Russia's difficulties. By mid-2022, Russia shifted its focus away from Kyiv and northern Ukraine, concentrating its efforts on securing the Donbas region in the east and expanding control over southern Ukraine. Cities such as Severodonetsk and Lysychansk became focal points of brutal urban warfare. Meanwhile, Russia's control over Crimea and its push towards the Black Sea coast became key strategic objectives. Ukraine's ability to withstand Russian aggression was largely due to the influx of military and financial support from Western nations. The United States, the European Union, and NATO countries provided billions of dollars in military equipment, including anti-tank missiles, drones, and air defense systems. The Western support extended beyond military aid, with financial assistance helping stabilize Ukraine's war-torn economy. The global response to the Ukraine-Russia war has been multifaceted, with far-reaching consequences for international politics, security, and economics. Several key elements characterize the international reaction. NATO's involvement, while not direct, has been pivotal. Member countries have funneled arms and intelligence support to Ukraine, trained Ukrainian forces, and established contingency plans in case the conflict spills into NATO territory. The European Union has similarly backed Ukraine politically, financially, and militarily, imposing sanctions on Russia and coordinating humanitarian efforts for Ukrainian refugees. The most immediate global response to the invasion was the imposition of sweeping economic sanctions on Russia. These included banning major Russian banks from the SWIFT system, freezing Russian central bank reserves, and targeting key industries such as oil and gas. Western businesses began divesting from Russia, and Russian assets abroad were frozen or seized. Over time, these sanctions severely impacted Russia's economy, leading to inflation, supply chain disruptions, and an exodus of foreign capital. Despite multiple rounds of talks in the early months of the war, diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire or peace deal have largely failed. Both Ukraine and Russia have set preconditions that the other side finds unacceptable. While Ukraine insists on the restoration of its territorial integrity, Russia demands recognition of its annexation of Crimea and the Donbas republics, among other conditions. Mediation efforts by Turkey, Germany, and other nations have not yielded a breakthrough. The war has had severe knock-on effects on global energy and food supplies. Europe, heavily reliant on Russian natural gas, faced an energy crisis as Russia cut off or reduced gas exports in retaliation for sanctions. Additionally, Ukraine, one of the world's leading exporters of wheat and other grains, struggled to export foodstuffs due to Russian blockades of Black Sea ports. This contributed to rising food prices globally, particularly in developing countries, exacerbating hunger and political instability. By 2023, Ukraine had launched a series of counteroffensives aimed at reclaiming occupied territories in the east and south. These operations, while slow and costly, have yielded significant gains, particularly in the Kharkiv region and parts of the Donbas. Ukraine has employed precision artillery, drone strikes, and sabotage operations to target Russian supply lines and logistical hubs. The destruction of key bridges, railways, and ammunition depots has severely disrupted Russian resupply efforts, leading to operational setbacks. The liberation of the Kharkiv region in late 2022 and early 2023 marked a turning point in the conflict. Ukrainian forces recaptured vast swathes of territory and forced Russian troops to retreat across the Oskol River. Similarly, the recapture of Kherson city in November 2022 was a major strategic victory for Ukraine, as it severed a crucial link between Russian forces in Crimea and the rest of the southern front. As the war continued into 2023 and 2024, Russia faced increasing challenges on the battlefield but responded with adaptive strategies and intensified efforts. Following early military setbacks, including the failure to capture Kyiv and significant losses in Kharkiv and Kherson, Russia shifted its focus towards a war of attrition. This new phase saw an increase in the use of long-range strikes, drone warfare, and attempts to fortify its occupied territories. By mid-2023, Russia had escalated its campaign of missile strikes, focusing on Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly energy facilities, water supplies, and transportation networks. These attacks, often timed to coincide with Ukraine's harsh winter, aimed to weaken civilian morale and disrupt Ukraine's logistics. Russia increasingly relied on Iranian-made Shahd 136 kamikaze drones, which have been a central tool in its air campaign. Despite Ukraine's growing air defense capabilities, these strikes continued to inflict significant damage on critical infrastructure. The Wagner Group, a Russian paramilitary organization, has played a key role in Russia's military operations, particularly in areas where regular Russian forces faced difficulties. The Wagner Group was heavily involved in the battle for Bakhmut and other key areas in eastern Ukraine, often employing brutal tactics. However, internal tensions between the Wagner leadership and the Russian Ministry of Defense led to strained cooperation, which affected Russia's military cohesion on the battlefield. In response to Ukraine's counteroffensive, Russia fortified its positions in the Donbas and Crimea regions. Defensive lines, consisting of trenches, mines, and fortified artillery positions, were established to slow Ukrainian advances. The construction of these extensive fortifications indicated that Russia was preparing for a prolonged conflict, one in which it could maintain control over occupied territories despite battlefield setbacks. Mobilization and military reforms. In late 2022, Russia announced a partial mobilization, calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists to bolster its depleted military ranks. This mobilization, while adding manpower, also exposed deep-rooted issues within the Russian military, including poor training, inadequate equipment, and low morale among conscripts. In 2023 and 2024, Russia attempted to address these issues by restructuring its military command and increasing investment in domestic arms production, but these efforts have had limited success in turning the tide of the war. The human toll of the Ukraine-Russia war has been staggering. The conflict has displaced millions of people, both within Ukraine and abroad, while causing widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure. The war has been marked by allegations of war crimes, with both sides accusing each other of atrocities. However, international observers and human rights organizations have documented numerous instances of indiscriminate attacks on civilians, particularly in areas occupied by Russian forces. The United Nations estimates that tens of thousands of civilians have been killed or wounded since the start of the conflict. Russian missile and artillery strikes have often hit residential areas, schools, and hospitals, leading to widespread suffering. In cities like Mariupol, Bucha, and Irpin, international investigations have uncovered evidence of mass graves, extrajudicial killings, and other war crimes committed by Russian forces. Ukraine, too, has faced allegations of mistreatment of prisoners of war, though these have not been as widely documented. The war has created one of the largest displacement crises in Europe since World War II. As of September 2024, over 8 million Ukrainians have fled the country, seeking refuge in neighboring countries like Poland, Germany, and Romania. Many more remain internally displaced, with their homes and livelihoods destroyed by the fighting. The refugee crisis has strained the resources of host countries, though the European Union and international humanitarian organizations have provided substantial aid. The destruction of civilian infrastructure, including power plants, water treatment facilities, and transportation networks, has created severe challenges for Ukraine. During the winter months, Russia's targeting of Ukraine's energy grid left millions without electricity or heating. International aid agencies have worked to provide emergency relief, but the scale of the destruction has made it difficult to fully address the needs of the population. Despite the challenges, international aid has played a critical role in mitigating the worst effects of the war. Organizations like the United Nations, Red Cross, and World Food Programme have delivered food, medical supplies, and shelter to millions of displaced Ukrainians. Additionally, many Western countries have provided financial assistance to the Ukrainian government to ensure the continued provision of essential services. In the Ukraine-Russia conflict, information warfare has played a pivotal role, shaping both domestic and international perceptions of the war. Both Ukraine and Russia have employed sophisticated strategies to control narratives, influence global opinion, and undermine the enemy's morale. From the outset, Ukraine has leveraged social media platforms to communicate directly with global audiences. President Zelensky, in particular, has used platforms like Twitter and Instagram to galvanize international support, posting updates on Ukraine's military efforts and appealing for humanitarian aid. Ukrainian civilians and soldiers have also used social media to document Russian atrocities, which have been widely shared and verified by international media outlets. Russia, for its part, has relied heavily on state-controlled media and online disinformation campaigns to shape the narrative of the war. Russian media outlets have consistently framed the conflict as a defensive operation against NATO aggression and have spread disinformation about Ukraine's government and military actions. Additionally, Russian-backed hackers have targeted Ukrainian government websites and critical infrastructure in cyber attacks aimed at disrupting communications and spreading fear. Beyond the immediate conflict zone, the war has sparked a broader information battle across the globe. Russian and Ukrainian narratives have competed for dominance in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where both sides seek to sway public opinion. While Western nations have largely supported Ukraine, many non-Western countries have remained neutral or expressed skepticism about the West's role in the conflict, often reflecting Russian disinformation efforts. Independent media organizations and fact-checking platforms have played a crucial role in debunking false claims and verifying reports from the battlefield. In an era of widespread misinformation, these organizations have helped ensure that accurate information about the war reaches global audiences, countering both Russian and Ukrainian propaganda. The war has had profound economic implications for both Ukraine and Russia, as well as the broader global economy. Both countries have experienced significant economic disruptions, but the nature and extent of these disruptions differ. The war has devastated Ukraine's economy, with entire industries shut down, agricultural production disrupted, and critical infrastructure destroyed. Ukraine's GDP contracted sharply in 2022 and 2023, though international aid and loans have helped stabilize the economy to some extent. The Ukrainian government has focused on maintaining essential services and financing the war effort, while also seeking international investment for post-war reconstruction. Russia's economy, while more resilient than initially expected, has been severely impacted by Western sanctions. These sanctions have targeted key sectors of Russia's economy, including its oil and gas industry, banking system, and defense sector. As a result, Russia has faced rising inflation, currency devaluation, and a growing dependence on countries like China and India to maintain its trade networks. Despite these challenges, Russia has continued to fund its war effort through oil exports and a growing black market for goods. The war has caused major disruptions in global energy markets, particularly in Europe, where countries had been heavily reliant on Russian gas. Following the imposition of sanctions, European nations sought alternative energy sources, resulting in higher prices and increased investment in renewable energy. The global shift away from Russian energy exports has had significant ramifications for Russia's economy and its ability to sustain the war. Ukraine, one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, has seen its agricultural sector severely impacted by the war. Russian blockades of Black Sea ports have made it difficult for Ukraine to export its agricultural products, contributing to global food shortages and rising prices, particularly in developing countries. International efforts to broker grain export deals, such as those led by Turkey and the UN, have provided some relief but remain vulnerable to disruptions. From the onset of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, international diplomatic efforts have sought to de-escalate tensions and broker peace. However, these efforts have largely been unsuccessful, with entrenched positions on both sides making negotiations particularly challenging. The war has drawn the involvement of numerous global powers, not only in their direct support for Ukraine but also through their mediation efforts and stances in international forums. Several rounds of peace talks between Ukraine and Russia were attempted in 2022, including negotiations mediated by Turkey and Germany. These early discussions, though promising at the outset, quickly faltered. Both sides presented irreconcilable demands. Ukraine demanded a complete withdrawal of Russian forces and the restoration of its territorial integrity, while Russia insisted on recognition of its annexation of Crimea and the Donbas republics as independent entities. Subsequent efforts by other mediators, including the United Nations, have failed to yield meaningful progress. Turkey, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has played a complex role in the conflict. As a member of NATO, Turkey has supported Ukraine, but it has also maintained a strategic relationship with Russia, particularly in energy and military industries. Turkey has successfully brokered deals such as the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed Ukrainian grain to be exported despite the Russian blockade. However, Ankar's balancing act between the two sides has limited its ability to push for a broader peace settlement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has remained a key figure in Ukraine's diplomatic strategy, frequently traveling abroad to meet with Western leaders and advocate for increased military aid and sanctions against Russia. Zelensky has been effective in galvanizing international support, especially in the European Union and the United States, where Ukraine's plight has become a central issue of foreign policy. In contrast, Russian President Vladimir Putin has focused on solidifying alliances with non-Western powers such as China, India, and Iran, presenting the war as a struggle against Western hegemony. While the West has largely isolated Russia, Moscow has deepened its ties with countries that have taken a neutral or sympathetic stance toward its actions in Ukraine. China, in particular, has been a critical ally for Russia, though Beijing has stopped short of providing direct military assistance. Instead, China has focused on maintaining trade with Russia, especially in energy, while pushing for peace talks that would preserve its economic interests. India has also continued purchasing Russian oil at discounted rates, benefiting from the sanctions-induced price drops. Internally, Russia has faced growing political, economic, and social pressures as a result of the war. Although the Russian government has maintained a narrative of strength and righteousness in its special military operation, the long-term impact of the conflict has begun to surface in various ways. Western sanctions, particularly those targeting Russia's financial institutions, technology sectors, and energy exports, have significantly affected the Russian economy. The Russian ruble has weakened, inflation has risen, and industries reliant on Western technologies, such as aviation and IT, have struggled to adapt. Despite government efforts to control the narrative through state media, there have been sporadic protests and dissent against the war within Russia. Anti-war protests, particularly in the early months of the conflict, were met with harsh crackdowns, with thousands of demonstrators arrested. Russian authorities have implemented strict censorship laws, making it illegal to criticize the military or refer to the invasion as a war. High-profile figures, including opposition leader Alexei Navalny, have used their platforms to condemn the war, but internal dissent remains heavily suppressed. In September 2022, Russia declared a partial mobilization, calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists to replenish its forces. This mobilization led to widespread panic, with thousands of Russian men fleeing the country to avoid conscription. The political cost of this decision was high, as it underscored the growing unpopularity of the war among ordinary Russians. The Russian government has since focused on recruiting volunteers and mercenaries, but the mobilization exposed cracks in Putin's domestic support. Putin's political future remains uncertain. While he has maintained a tight grip on power throughout the war, some analysts believe that prolonged military failure and economic hardship could undermine his position. Rumors of dissatisfaction within the Russian elite and military have surfaced, though there is no clear indication of a serious challenge to his leadership at this point. However, as the war drags on and casualties mount, the possibility of political upheaval in Russia cannot be entirely ruled out. One of the unintended consequences of Russia's invasion has been the unification of Ukraine's diverse political and social groups. The war has fostered a strong sense of nationalism, with Ukrainians rallying around their government and military in a collective effort to defend the country. Originally a comedian and political outsider, Zelensky has transformed into a wartime leader, winning admiration both domestically and internationally. His decision to remain in Kyiv during the early days of the invasion, when Russian forces were closing in on the capital, became a symbolic moment that rallied the Ukrainian people. Despite the war's toll on the economy, Ukraine has managed to maintain a functioning government and civil society. Essential services continue to operate, albeit under significant strain, and the Ukrainian economy, though severely damaged, has been propped up by international aid. Ukrainian businesses have adapted to the wartime conditions, with some shifting operations to safer regions in the west of the country. The rebuilding of liberated areas, such as parts of the Kharkiv and Kherson regions, has begun, though the scale of the destruction means that full recovery will take years. Local and national elections have been postponed, but the government has emphasized the importance of maintaining democratic governance. Anti-corruption efforts, a key focus of Ukraine's pre-war political agenda, have continued, though the war has complicated the implementation of reforms. By 2024, the military dynamics of the Ukraine-Russia war have shifted significantly from the early days of rapid advances to a prolonged and grueling war of attrition. Both sides have entrenched themselves along the front lines, with the battle for control of key regions continuing unabated. The Donbas region remains a key battleground, where control over the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk has long been contested. Since Russia's full-scale invasion, its forces have poured significant resources into capturing the entire Donbas area. However, Ukrainian defenses in cities like Bakhmut and Soledar have withstood relentless attacks. Despite being outgunned, Ukrainian forces have leveraged their knowledge of the terrain and local support to carry out effective counteroffensives in areas like Lyman, repelling several Russian advances. This region has become symbolic of Ukraine's resilience and strategic importance in the war. The southern front, particularly around the strategically crucial cities of Kherson and Zaporizhia, has seen intense fighting since 2022. After recapturing the city of Kherson in late 2022, Ukrainian forces have sought to push further south toward Crimea, but Russian forces have entrenched their positions, making further advances difficult. Ukraine's counteroffensive efforts in the south have been bolstered by long-range missile strikes on Russian military infrastructure, supply lines, and bridges connecting Crimea to mainland Ukraine. Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014, has remained a focal point of the conflict. Ukrainian strikes on Russian naval and military installations in Crimea, including the Sevastopol naval base, have demonstrated Ukraine's ability to project power far beyond its front lines. These attacks have forced Russia to bolster its defenses in Crimea, diverting resources from other fronts. The potential recapture of Crimea remains a strategic goal for Ukraine, but it is heavily fortified by Russian forces. Russia has increasingly relied on fortifications and entrenched positions to slow down Ukraine's counteroffensives. These defensive lines, particularly in the Donbas and southern Ukraine, include extensive trench systems, minefields, and artillery positions. While these defenses have made rapid advances difficult for Ukraine, they have also turned the conflict into a war of attrition, with high casualties on both sides. Ukraine's military successes have been greatly aided by Western-supplied weaponry, including HIMARS rocket systems, anti-tank weapons, drones, and air defense systems. These advanced systems have allowed Ukraine to strike Russian supply lines and military infrastructure with precision, limiting Russia's ability to sustain prolonged offensives. The continued flow of Western arms has been critical in maintaining Ukraine's battlefield momentum. Western military support has been one of the defining factors in Ukraine's ability to resist the Russian invasion and launch counteroffensives. The scale and scope of this aid have increased dramatically since the early days of the war, with billions of dollars in military equipment, training, and intelligence being provided to Kyiv. The delivery of HIMARS, high-mobility artillery rocket systems, in 2022 was a game-changer for Ukrainian forces. These long-range precision rocket systems have enabled Ukraine to target Russian ammunition depots, command centers, and logistics hubs deep behind the front lines. Along with artillery systems like the M777 howitzers, HIMARS has helped Ukraine disrupt Russian supply lines and slow down advances. Western-supplied air defense systems, including the Patriot missile system and NASAMS, have played a vital role in defending Ukrainian cities from Russian missile and drone strikes. These systems have allowed Ukraine to intercept a significant percentage of incoming missiles, reducing the damage to critical infrastructure and civilian areas. As Russia continues its air campaign, these systems remain crucial in maintaining Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Beyond providing hardware, NATO countries have been involved in training Ukrainian troops, helping them operate advanced weapon systems, and offering strategic guidance. Intelligence sharing between Ukraine and its Western allies has also been a key factor in Ukraine's success in targeting Russian military assets. This real-time intelligence has allowed Ukraine to execute precision strikes and anticipate Russian movements. The Ukraine-Russia war has extended into cyberspace, with both sides engaging in cyber warfare to disrupt military operations, critical infrastructure, and communication networks. The cyber domain has become a critical front in the conflict, with widespread hacking attempts, disinformation campaigns, and cyber attacks occurring throughout the war. Russia has long been regarded as one of the world's most capable actors in cyber warfare. Throughout the conflict, Russian cyber attacks have targeted Ukraine's energy grid, banking sector, and government websites. These attacks, often conducted by state-backed hacker groups such as Sandworm and Fancy Bear, have sought to sow chaos and undermine Ukraine's ability to function. Although many of these attacks were repelled by Ukrainian cyber defenses, they demonstrated Russia's commitment to using cyber tools to complement its military efforts. Despite being the target of sophisticated cyber attacks, Ukraine has developed robust cyber defense capabilities, often with the support of Western countries and private companies. Microsoft, Google, and other tech giants have provided assistance in defending against Russian hacking attempts. In addition to defending its infrastructure, Ukraine has also launched its own cyber attacks on Russian government websites, banks, and military networks, disrupting Russian operations and leaking sensitive information. The war has seen unprecedented collaboration between governments and private technology companies. Elon Musk's Starlink, for example, has been instrumental in maintaining Ukraine's communication networks, especially in areas where infrastructure has been destroyed by Russian shelling. Other companies, such as Google, have helped protect Ukrainian government and military servers from cyber attacks, while also aiding in the dissemination of reliable information to counter Russian disinformation. As the war enters its third year, the long-term geopolitical, economic, and societal implications are becoming clearer. The conflict has not only reshaped Ukraine and Russia but has also had profound effects on the international order. The war has fundamentally altered the global security architecture. NATO, which had been experiencing internal divisions before the war, has emerged more unified and stronger than it has been in decades. Finland and Sweden's decisions to join NATO, motivated by security concerns over Russia, reflect the shifting dynamics in Europe. This expansion of NATO has further isolated Russia, reinforcing the division between the West and Russia in global politics. The European Union has also been deeply affected by the conflict. The war has accelerated the EU's efforts to reduce its dependence on Russian energy, leading to major investments in renewable energy and alternative energy supplies. The EU's economic and military support for Ukraine has brought the bloc closer together, although the economic consequences of the war, including inflation and energy shortages, have created challenges for European economies. Russia's geopolitical standing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has significantly diminished its standing on the global stage. Sanctions have isolated Russia from much of the international community, and its economy, while still functioning, has been weakened. Moreover, Russia's military failures have exposed vulnerabilities that have diminished its reputation as a global power. In the long term, Russia may become increasingly dependent on alliances with China, India, and other non-Western nations to sustain its economy and international relevance. As the war grinds on into its third year, the long-term task of rebuilding Ukraine has become a focal point for both Ukrainian leadership and the international community. Despite the ongoing conflict, efforts to plan for the country's recovery are already underway. However, the scale of the destruction, combined with the deep economic damage inflicted by the war, means that recovery will be an enormous challenge requiring sustained international assistance. The war has devastated Ukraine's infrastructure, with entire cities, particularly in the east and south, reduced to rubble. Vital infrastructure such as power plants, water treatment facilities, schools, and hospitals has been heavily targeted by Russian missile strikes. Cities like Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Severodonetsk have been almost completely destroyed. Rebuilding these cities will take years, if not decades, and will require significant financial resources. Ukraine's post-war reconstruction is expected to be one of the largest rebuilding efforts since World War II. The European Union, the United States, and international financial institutions like the World Bank have already pledged billions of dollars in aid to help Ukraine recover. The Ukraine Recovery Conference, held in London in mid-2023, focused on mobilizing resources for reconstruction, emphasizing the importance of international investment and public-private partnerships. The reconstruction effort will also focus on modernizing Ukraine's infrastructure, with an emphasis on energy security, rebuilding schools, hospitals, and transportation systems, and enhancing agricultural productivity. Given Ukraine's aspirations for closer ties with the European Union, the country's rebuilding will also focus on aligning its regulatory and institutional frameworks with EU standards. Even as Ukraine fights for its survival, the government has emphasized the importance of continuing political reforms, particularly in the areas of governance, rule of law, and anti-corruption. Ukraine's desire to eventually join the European Union has driven these reforms, which are seen as essential for attracting foreign investment and ensuring long-term stability. However, the war has made it difficult to fully implement these reforms, as much of the country's resources and attention remain focused on the conflict. The war has brought calls for accountability for war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. International organizations, including the International Criminal Court, ICC, have been investigating allegations of atrocities, including attacks on civilians, extrajudicial killings, and the use of banned weapons. Ensuring justice for victims will be a key component of Ukraine's post-war recovery, as the country seeks to heal from the traumas inflicted by the conflict. Russia, too, faces significant challenges as the war drags on. While the country has weathered the immediate impact of Western sanctions and military losses, its long-term prospects are increasingly uncertain. The war has isolated Russia diplomatically, strained its economy, and exposed weaknesses within its military and political structures. Economy has been hit hard by the war, particularly by the extensive Western sanctions imposed in response to its invasion of Ukraine. Sanctions have targeted Russia's financial institutions, technology sectors, and energy exports. While Russia has managed to find alternative markets for its oil and gas, particularly in China and India, the loss of European markets has been a significant blow. Additionally, the technology sector has been crippled by sanctions, with key components for electronics, aviation, and defense industries now unavailable. The Russian ruble has weakened, inflation has surged, and many Western companies have pulled out of the country, leading to job losses and a decline in consumer confidence. Despite the Kremlin's efforts to maintain control over the economy, Russia's long-term economic outlook remains bleak, especially as it becomes more dependent on a narrow set of trading partners. Russia's international isolation has deepened since the invasion. Once a significant player in global politics, Russia has now been largely excluded from Western forums such as the G7 and has seen its influence wane in Europe. The expansion of NATO with the inclusion of Finland and Sweden further highlights Russia's diplomatic failures. In response, Russia has sought to strengthen its relationships with countries that have taken a more neutral stance on the conflict, including China, India, and Iran. These relationships, while economically beneficial, do not fully compensate for Russia's loss of influence in Europe and the broader West. Additionally, Russia's growing dependence on China could limit its geopolitical autonomy in the long run, as it increasingly becomes the junior partner in the Sino-Russian relationship. The war has exposed cracks in the Kremlin's control over Russian society. While President Vladimir Putin has maintained his grip on power through censorship, propaganda, and the suppression of dissent, the war has led to growing dissatisfaction within the Russian elite and military. The partial mobilization in 2022 was deeply unpopular, prompting protests and a mass exodus of young men from the country. As the war drags on and military casualties mount, there are increasing questions about the long-term stability of Putin's regime. While there is no immediate threat to his rule, political analysts have speculated that prolonged military failures, economic hardship, and internal dissent could lead to political upheaval in the future. The Ukraine-Russia war has had far-reaching consequences for the global geopolitical order, reshaping alliances, power dynamics, and international institutions. As the war continues, the long-term impact on global politics is becoming clearer. One of the most significant consequences of the war has been the expansion of NATO, with Finland and Sweden formally joining the alliance in 2023. This marks a dramatic shift in European security policy, as both countries had previously maintained a policy of military non-alignment. The expansion of NATO not only strengthens the alliance's eastern flank but also highlights Russia's failure to prevent further NATO enlargement, one of the Kremlin's stated goals when it launched the war. In addition to NATO's expansion, European countries have increased their defense spending, with Germany, France, and other nations committing to bolster their military capabilities. The war has prompted a rethinking of defense policies across Europe, with a renewed emphasis on collective security and the deterrence of Russian aggression. The war has accelerated the shift towards a more multipolar world, where power is distributed among several global actors rather than dominated by a single superpower. The rise of China, India, and other non-Western powers has been a key feature of this emerging order. Russia's increasing reliance on these countries, particularly China, reflects this shift. At the same time, the war has strengthened the unity of Western alliances, particularly NATO and the European Union, while also prompting closer cooperation between Western democracies and Indo-Pacific powers like Japan, Australia, and South Korea. The global realignment of power has implications not only for Europe but for regions such as the Indo-Pacific, where China's growing assertiveness poses new challenges. The war has also put significant strain on international institutions like the United Nations, which has struggled to effectively respond to the crisis. Russia's veto power in the UN Security Council has blocked any substantive action against its invasion of Ukraine, raising questions about the relevance of the UN in addressing major international conflicts. In response, some countries have called for reforms to the UN system, particularly regarding the use of veto power in situations involving war crimes or humanitarian crises. However, such reforms are unlikely in the near term, given the entrenched positions of the permanent members of the Security Council. As the Ukraine-Russia war continues into its third year, the global geopolitical landscape has been dramatically altered. The conflict has redefined relationships among the world's major powers, intensified competition between global blocs, and raised critical questions about the future of international governance and law. One of the most profound impacts of the Ukraine-Russia war has been the solidification of the NATO alliance. Before the war, there were concerns about NATO's relevance, with divisions among member states about security priorities. However, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has reinvigorated NATO's purpose. The expansion of NATO, with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, marks a significant strategic shift and underscores the collective Western resolve to deter further Russian aggression. NATO has increased its troop presence in Eastern Europe and has integrated defense strategies to counter Russian military threats. Beyond NATO, the war has strengthened the transatlantic alliance between the United States and the European Union. The EU, once reliant on Russian energy, has pivoted toward energy independence, with member states coordinating to diversify energy supplies and increase defense spending. This new sense of unity within the West is likely to persist, with long-term implications for global security. China's rise in the global order. As the war isolates Russia from Western economies and diplomatic circles, China has emerged as an increasingly influential player. Beijing's neutrality in the conflict has allowed it to maintain trade relationships with Russia while positioning itself as a potential mediator. China's global ambitions, particularly through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, have been furthered as the war diverts Western attention away from the Indo-Pacific region. While China has refrained from directly supporting Russia's war effort, its economic and diplomatic ties with Moscow have deepened. This partnership, though unequal, serves both nations' interests. Russia seeks to avoid total international isolation, while China capitalizes on Russia's resource wealth and potential as a counterweight to US global influence. India has also played a significant role in the shifting geopolitical landscape. While India has maintained a neutral stance in the conflict, its purchases of discounted Russian oil have drawn scrutiny from Western countries. Nevertheless, India's strategic importance as a counterbalance to China has prevented any serious deterioration in its relationships with the West. The war has highlighted India's emerging role as a major power navigating between Western and Russian interests. The war has exacerbated existing geopolitical tensions in the global south, particularly in Africa and Latin America. Rising food prices, driven by disruptions in Ukrainian grain exports, have hit these regions hard, increasing political instability and humanitarian crises. While the West has focused on the direct impacts of the war in Europe, the conflict has shown that its consequences are truly global. The Ukraine-Russia war has also raised significant questions about the role of international law and governance. The failure of the United Nations to effectively prevent or stop the conflict, combined with Russia's use of its veto power in the Security Council, has revealed the limitations of current global governance systems in addressing major conflicts. One of the major legal issues stemming from the war is the accountability for alleged war crimes committed by Russian forces. International bodies, including the International Criminal Court, ICC, have launched investigations into atrocities committed during the conflict, including the targeting of civilians, forced deportations, and the use of banned weapons. These investigations are critical not only for justice in Ukraine but also for upholding the norms of international humanitarian law. However, bringing perpetrators to justice will be challenging. Russia has not recognized the jurisdiction of the ICC, and its leadership is unlikely to face prosecution unless there is a change in the domestic political landscape. This highlights the limitations of international law in holding powerful states accountable for their actions. The UN's inability to prevent the Ukraine-Russia war or effectively intervene has sparked debates about the need for reform in global governance. Russia's veto power in the UN Security Council has paralyzed international efforts to address the conflict, while also exposing the flaws in a system where the actions of a single member can override the will of the international community. There have been calls for reforms, such as limiting veto use in cases of mass atrocities or war crimes, but such changes would require the consent of all permanent members, including Russia and China, making them highly unlikely in the current geopolitical environment. The war has, however, underscored the importance of regional organizations and alliances like NATO and the EU in responding to global crises when the UN is unable to act. As the war grinds on, its legacy will be felt for decades, not only in Ukraine and Russia but across the world. The conflict has reshaped global alliances, influenced economic policy, and challenged the norms of international law and order. The war has galvanized Ukrainian nationalism, and the country's eventual reconstruction and recovery will likely be a key focus for the international community. Ukraine's aspiration to join the European Union and NATO has been strengthened by the war, though these goals will depend on the outcome of the conflict and the willingness of Western allies to integrate Ukraine into their institutions. Ukraine's future, however, will also depend on the extent of its territorial recovery. The status of Crimea, as well as the Donbas region, remains a significant question. Any peace settlement will need to address these disputed territories, though the Ukrainian government has stated that it will not accept any agreement that compromises its territorial integrity. Russia's place in the global order. Russia's future is also uncertain. The war has weakened its economy, isolated it diplomatically, and exposed the limits of its military power. While Russia will likely remain a major global player due to its energy resources and nuclear capabilities, its influence in Europe and the broader international community has diminished significantly. The war's outcome could also determine Russia's domestic political future. Prolonged military failure, combined with economic hardship, could lead to growing internal dissent, potentially destabilizing Putin's regime. However, any significant political change in Russia remains speculative at this point. The Ukraine-Russia war has accelerated the shift toward a multipolar world order, where power is distributed among several global actors rather than concentrated in the hands of one or two superpowers. The rise of China, India, and other emerging powers, combined with Russia's pivot toward non-Western alliances, underscores this trend. The West's unity in response to the conflict, however, suggests that the traditional liberal order still holds significant sway. This new multipolar world will be characterized by more competition and less cooperation, as global powers pursue their own interests in an increasingly fragmented international system. The conflict in Ukraine may be one of the first major flashpoints in this new era of geopolitical rivalry. The future of the Ukraine-Russia conflict will depend on multiple factors, including military outcomes, international support, and internal political developments in both countries. Several potential scenarios can be envisioned as the war continues, each carrying profound implications for the global order. Scenario 1: a prolonged war of attrition. In this scenario, the war continues for several more years without a decisive victory for either side. Russia continues to hold on to key territories in the east and south, while Ukraine maintains its Western-backed counteroffensives but struggles to regain all lost land. A war of attrition would drain both countries' resources, with devastating economic and human costs. This scenario risks increasing global instability, as prolonged conflict in Europe could escalate into wider international crises. Scenario 2. Ukrainian victory and reintegration. With continued Western support, Ukraine could achieve significant military victories and regain most, if not all, of its occupied territories, including Crimea. This outcome would solidify Ukraine's path toward full integration into the European Union and NATO, while delivering a significant blow to Russian prestige and influence. Such a scenario would likely weaken the Russian government and could lead to internal political changes in Moscow. Scenario 3. Russian territorial gains and frozen conflict. Should Russia manage to hold onto the territories it currently occupies and push Ukraine into a negotiated settlement, the war could enter a frozen phase, much like previous conflicts in places such as Transnistria or Georgia. A frozen conflict would leave parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea under Russian control indefinitely, with sporadic fighting and international mediation efforts continuing. Ukraine's Western integration might be delayed, and Russia would maintain a foothold in the region. Scenario 4. Political change in Russia. Prolonged economic hardship, military failures, or internal dissent could lead to political instability in Russia, potentially ending President Putin's long rule. This could result in either a more democratic regime that seeks peace and reintegration with the global community or, alternatively, a more hardline government that doubles down on nationalist policies. The political evolution of Russia is one of the most unpredictable variables in the conflict. Regardless of the outcome of the war, Ukraine's role in the international system will be significantly altered. The conflict has already reshaped Ukraine's identity, alliances, and geopolitical importance. Post-war Ukraine will likely be a critical player in European security, economy, and politics. Closer integration with the West. Ukraine's future integration into NATO and the European Union seems all but inevitable, should the conflict conclude in a way that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty. The EU has already taken steps to fast-track Ukraine's membership application, while NATO's ongoing support has deepened military ties. Ukraine's reconstruction will further bond it to Western institutions, as much of the financial and technical assistance is likely to come from Europe and the United States. Economic and military power post-war Ukraine will likely emerge as a major military power within Europe, with a battle-hardened army equipped with modern Western technology. Economically, while Ukraine faces immense challenges in rebuilding its war-ravaged infrastructure, it has the potential to become an important hub for agriculture, technology, and energy, particularly if reconstruction efforts focus on modernizing its industries. Symbol of resistance and democracy. Ukraine's success in resisting Russian aggression has already made it a symbol of democratic resilience against authoritarianism. This symbolic role could extend beyond Europe, influencing pro-democracy movements around the world. Ukraine's experience may serve as a model for other countries facing external threats or internal pressures from autocratic forces. Russia's global role will largely depend on the outcome of the war, but even in the best-case scenario for Moscow, its standing has been significantly diminished. The long-term impacts of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military losses will shape Russia's future as a global actor. If Russia remains under the leadership of Vladimir Putin or a similar regime, it is likely to continue its path of diplomatic isolation from the West. However, economic necessity may push Russia to seek reintegration with the global economy, particularly if sanctions relief becomes a condition of post-war negotiations. Any reintegration would require Russia to make significant concessions, including territorial withdrawals or accountability for war crimes. As its relationships with the West fray, Russia may turn increasingly toward non-Western powers such as China, India, and Iran. This shift could foster deeper economic and security ties in Asia and the Middle East, with Russia positioning itself as a key energy supplier and military partner. However, this would come at the cost of greater dependence on these countries, particularly China. Internally, the war's consequences could lead to significant political changes in Russia. Prolonged economic hardship, combined with growing public dissatisfaction over military failures, could weaken Putin's regime and lead to political turmoil. While a democratic transition in Russia remains unlikely in the short term, the possibility of internal power struggles or regime change could alter the country's trajectory. The Ukraine-Russia war has become one of the most significant global conflicts of the 21st century, reshaping the geopolitical landscape and altering the course of both nations involved. As the war continues, its legacy will be felt across multiple dimensions: military, economic, political, and social, both within the region and globally. For Ukraine, the war has solidified its national identity, forged stronger alliances with the West, and created a path for eventual integration into NATO and the European Union. Despite immense challenges, Ukraine's resilience has transformed it into a symbol of democratic resistance against authoritarianism, with the potential for post-war economic revival. For Russia, the war has isolated it diplomatically, weakened its economy, and exposed the limitations of its military power. While Russia may seek closer ties with non-Western powers, its global influence has diminished, and the future of its political leadership remains uncertain. For the world, the war has triggered a broader reconfiguration of alliances and accelerated the shift toward a multipolar global order. NATO's expansion, Europe's push for energy independence, and the rise of non-Western powers have all been influenced by the conflict. Moreover, the war has raised pressing questions about the effectiveness of international law, governance, and the future of global security. As the war continues to evolve, its long-term consequences are likely to reverberate for decades, shaping the geopolitical, economic, and military trajectories of both Ukraine and Russia, while also influencing the broader global order in profound ways.